Robin Emmett, Reuters. Secretary General, given the fact that the 28 allies of NATO are already members of the counter-Daesh coalition, why should US President Trump be won over by the decision to join the coalition as NATO? Thank you.
NATO plays a role in the fight against terrorism in many different ways. We are supporting already the global coalition to defeat ISIS. Many allies would like to see NATO as a full member of the coalition for two reasons. Partly because it sends a strong and clear message of unity in the fight against terrorism. And especially in light of the terrorist attacks in Manchester, I think it's important that we send this unified message of that we stand together in the fight against terrorism. But then NATO joining the coalition will also provide a better platform for coordinating the activities of NATO, NATO allies, and other partners in the coalition in the fight against terrorism. So it's partly a political argument, which is presented by many allies, that we will send a strong political message, and partly a practical argument that having NATO being part of the information flows, the meetings, the consultations in the coalition will improve the way we coordinate the efforts of NATO with other NATO allies already being part of the coalition.
Lady in the first row, please introduce yourself.
My name is Erin McPike from Washington, D.C. And on the occasion of President Trump's visit tomorrow, he has not yet publicly backed Article 5. Has he backed it to you privately? Do you expect it to do it here tomorrow publicly? And separate from that, we also learned last week that he shared Israeli intelligence with Russian officials in the White House. You'll be discussing increased intelligence sharing tomorrow night. Are you concerned that he will betray any members of the alliance, and do you expect to discuss that with him? Do you expect other heads of state to discuss that with him tomorrow? Will you put controls in place so that he does not betray any members of the alliance?
President Trump has clearly stated his strong support to NATO. And the core task of NATO is collective defense. So by expressing strong support to NATO, to our security guarantees, the United States, President Trump, his security team, has also, of course, expressed strong support to Article 5, because Article 5, collective defense, is NATO's core task. And he has stated that publicly, but he also, of course, stated that in meetings with me. We spoke on the phone after he was elected twice, and we met also last month in the White House discussing NATO and the whole NATO agenda. This is not only expressed by him, but is also expressed by the Vice President when he visited NATO, Secretary Tillerson, Secretary Mattis. They have all expressed in meetings and publicly their strong support to NATO and the security guarantees, which then, of course, includes collective defense and Article 5. Second, this is a support for collective defense, not only in words, but also in deeds from the United States. Yesterday, the Trump administration presented a budget where they increase funding for US military presence in Europe by 40%, which is a significant increase that comes on top of the increase we saw last year. And that enables an increased military presence of US forces, more exercises, more equipment, more training, more pre-positioned supplies, weapons, ammunition, and more investments in infrastructure. So after many years of a decline in US military presence in Europe, we now see for the first time in many years an increase. So this is a commitment to our collective defense from the United States, not only words, but also in deeds. Intelligence, sorry. Well, intelligence, sharing intelligence is a core activity for NATO. We have shared intelligence for many, many years in this alliance. And actually, we are stepping up our sharing of intelligence because we have established a new intelligence division, and I also expect us to make new decisions on how we can do even more on intelligence tomorrow when we meet the leaders. And of course, I trust all allies that they are able to handle intelligence in a good way. And that's what we have been able to do for many, many years, and we will also continue to do that.
Wall Street Journal.
Mr. Secretary General, you mentioned a couple times the budget proposal from the Trump administration. Do you think that in any way lessens the pressure on Europe to spend more on its own defense if the United States is going to provide, more troops and more deterrence? And as a related matter, last year you talked about $10 billion in extra funding from European allies. What would constitute success in your mind in 2017 and beyond in terms of annual increases in defense spending from Europe?
Increased US military presence in Europe does not weaken the need for European allies to invest more in defense. And what we saw last year was that there is not either more US or more Europe. Actually, in 2016, we got more of both. In 2016 was the first year after many years of decline that we saw increased European investment in defense. But at the same time, we saw increased US presence. So based on what we saw last year, it's absolutely possible to have both more US and more Europe investing in defense. So actually, there's no contradiction. It's not either or, it's both, and we need both. We publish numbers and figures twice a year in NATO. In February, in my annual report, we published the estimates for 2016, for defense spending in 2016, and the estimate is $10 billion euros. Yeah. And we will have new figures in June, more so final figures. In June, we will also then provide estimates for 2017. I will not give you any specific numbers, and I don't have a clear, number which is the difference between success and not success. But I expect the European allies and Canada as a total to continue to increase in defense spending, moving towards the 2% target.
Okay, Washington Post.
Michael Birnbaum from the Washington Post. A related question about the U.S. defense budget. You have said, a succession of U.S. Officials have said, Donald Trump has said that the U.S. cannot sort of sustain this, can't hold Europe's defense on its back. And we've heard for years now this mantra in the United States that the U.S. public will not support major defense spending here when allies aren't doing the same thing. To follow on Julian's question, it does seem like a bit of a contradiction that Trump is, on the one hand, saying the U.S. won't, there's no political will to keep spending money on Europe, along with this major increase. Are you worried that this is kind of running beyond the political will in the United States, and there actually could be a diminishing of support? This could actually be damaging to U.S. support for NATO, given all this talk that we're constantly hearing about declining U.S. willingness, popular willingness to spend on Europe?
So I would have been worried if we saw a decline in European defense spending, but we see the opposite. After many years of decline, we see now an increase. We turned the corner in 2015, which was the first year after many years of cuts that we didn't saw any cuts in European defense spending. Actually, we saw a small increase. Then in 2016, we saw a significant increase in defense spending in Europe, and I expect defense spending in Europe to continue in 2017, but I don't have any estimates before June. Then, on top of increased defense spending in Europe, we also see that European allies are stepping up in other ways, by, for instance, being the lead nations for our new Spirit force. That is something many different European allies have taken on, and they are leading the spearhead force. UK and Germany are also lead nations for our enhanced forward presence, our battle groups in Estonia and Lithuania. So European allies are stepping up not only by investing more in defense, but also providing capabilities, contributions to NATO missions and operations, and our high readiness and our enhanced presence in the eastern part of the alliance. For me, this is only an additional argument for the US to invest in defense. And I think by showing that Europeans are stepping up, it's easier to go to the US Congress and ask for more. And I think actually that's what we have seen this year. Then I would also like to say that yesterday I saw a new opinion poll showing that it was a significant increased support for NATO in the United States. So actually the popular support for NATO has increased over the last year in the United States, something I welcome very much, which I think it makes it even easier to invest in our alliance, because this alliance is important both for the United States and for Europe.
Al Arabiya, second row. Second gentleman.
From Al Arabiya News Channel. Mr. Secretary General, you said recently that NATO is not ready to deploy battle forces on the ground in Iraq and Syria. I would like to ask you, what will be NATO contribution if you take the decision to augment your role in the fight against Daesh? And subsidiary question, how long will you be supporting Iraq in the training missions? Thank you.
There has been no request for any NATO combat role, and there is no discussion at all about engaging NATO in a combat role in the counter-ISIL coalition. And we have to remember that also outside the counter-ISIL coalition, when it comes to what NATO does in Afghanistan, we have ended our combat role. We don't conduct combat operations in Afghanistan anymore. We have 13,000 troops in Afghanistan, but what they do is train, assist, and advise, because we strongly believe that in the long run, it is more sustainable that we enable local forces, local governments, local institutions to defend their own country, to fight terrorism themselves, and to stabilize their own countries, instead of NATO doing that through big combat operations with big number of combat troops on the ground. So the idea of training is really a main message from NATO, because we strongly believe in enabling local forces, local governments to stabilize their own countries. So therefore, it's totally out of question for NATO to engage in any combat operations. What we are focused on, both in Afghanistan and in Iraq and other places, is how can we train, assist, and advise, and that's what we have started to do in Afghanistan. What we do in Afghanistan, and what we now have started also to do for Iraqi forces, first in Jordan and now inside Iraq. There is no timetable for how long we will stay, but we will assess and see how long that will be needed.
Jordanian News Agency, third gentleman there.
Zak Shab from Arabs Today. Secretary General, the war against terrorism started practically seriously in 2001. At that time, Al-Qaeda was in a few mountains in Afghanistan. Now terrorism and extremism is nearly everywhere, at the doorsteps of all of us. And many in the Middle East saying that the West has failed in taking out the causes and the reasons why these extreme groups and extreme elements are successfully recruiting more terrorists worldwide, by not giving like a just solution for just problems like the Arab-Israeli conflict. So many believe that the more the West ignores a serious solution for the Arab-Israeli conflict, the more these extreme elements will take advantage and recruit ignorant and very simple people anywhere, all around the globe. So do you think that there will be sometime soon that a serious decision in trying to take these tools of recruitment away from these terrorist groups? Thank you.
I strongly believe that we need many different tools in the fight against terrorism. And one part of the effort to fight terrorism is to address the root causes, the instability, the conflicts, the violence we see in many places in the world, but in the wider Middle East region. And therefore, I support efforts to try to find political solutions, negotiated solutions, to many of the conflicts which are, what should I say, creating the ground for terrorism. And for instance, in Afghanistan, of course, the aim is to find a political negotiated solution. We also support the efforts to try to find a negotiated solution to the different conflicts we see in the Middle East. So that's an important part of the efforts to address the terrorist threat. But then sometimes you also need military means, and then NATO has a role to play. And that's what we have done in Afghanistan and elsewhere. So there is no contradiction between either being focused on trying to find political solutions and at the same time trying to address the military needs.
Tolo TV, first row, yeah.
Thank you. Lutfullah Najafizadeh with Tolo News. Mr. Secretary General, what do you expect from an increased, let's say, 5,000 NATO and US troops in Afghanistan, while a big surge back in 2009 didn't produce the results expected? And now with ISIS, Daesh very strong in Afghanistan, would it encourage NATO to be involved in some sort of direct combat role against ISIS, given that they are not directly related to ISIS in the Middle East? Some of them are local ISIS, either from Afghanistan or Pakistan. And how would you differentiate them with the Taliban? Second question relates to Russia's reported support for the Taliban. How concerned are you about that? Thank you.
The situation now, compared to the surge in Afghanistan some years ago, is very different. And actually the purpose is totally different. Because at that time, NATO and the United States, so United States being part of NATO, but also with their own activities and operations in Afghanistan, then we were engaged in a big combat operation. Since then, we have been able to build up a strong national Afghan army and security force. From almost nothing to now around 350,000 troops and policemen. So at the end of 2014, we handed over the responsibility for the security in Afghanistan to Afghanistan, to the Afghan National Army and Defense Forces. And they have proven capable, professional, and they have been able to counter every time Taliban has attacked. And they have proven also able to fight the many different terrorist groups, including ISIS, in Afghanistan. So when there is now a request for a few thousand more troops, it's something completely different than the surge back in 2009 and 10. Because then it was a big surge in the combat operation. Now it is a request for a few thousand more troops to do more training. And the aim and capacity building, at least in the NATO framework. And the aim of that is to, for instance, further strengthen the Afghan Special Operation Forces. They are proven extremely important in the fight against Taliban and terrorist groups. To strengthen the air defenses, the Air Force of Afghanistan. I met some female pilots trained by NATO. So Afghanistan is now developing their own air forces. And also some officers and key academies to increase command and control. All of this is about enabling Afghanistan, the Afghan security forces, to stabilize their own country. Well, we urge Russia to be part of an Afghan-led peace process. The aim is to reconcile and find a negotiated solution. And this has to be an Afghan-led peace process. And of course, we have seen reports, but we haven't seen any, final proof of direct support from Russia to Taliban. So I think we should now focus on what can we do to support the peace process, which should be Afghan-led.
NPR.
Hi, thank you. Terry Schultz with NPR and Deutsche Welle. How do you explain to the allies that are worried about the slippery slope principle when the war in Afghanistan started, it also wasn't a NATO-led combat role in 2001. By 2003, it was. So you have a perfect example for those who are worried that this is the first step toward a combat role for NATO in counter-ISIS operations. And secondly, Juana, don't look at me. How worried are you as the investigation in the United States continues, the investigation into Russian meddling, now not just in the election, but into the inner circle of the Trump administration? Doesn't that affect the credibility of operations here when you're working on trying to affect Russian activities? And you have evidence that there was a significant amount of influence on the Trump administration. Thank you.
Allies, all 28 allies decide what NATO does. And there has been, as I said, no request, no call for a NATO combat role. Actually, I think we have to look in a way beyond the combat operation. Because the challenge is that when Mosul is liberated, then we need some forces on the ground to be able to keep the territory and to make sure that Iraq becomes a stable country. So I think what we have learned from Iraq, from Afghanistan, from Libya, and many other countries, is that one thing is the military combat operation, but perhaps more demanding in the long run is to stabilize after the combat operations have ended. And that's what NATO is focusing on when we now are engaged in training, assisting, and capacity building in Afghanistan, but also focus on that in for instance, Iraq. So again, NATO will only do what the allies want us to do. There has been no call for a combat role. I don't see any need for a combat role, but I see a big need for NATO to do more together with allies and the coalition to build the capacity which we need in Iraq to be sure that Iraq is a stable country when the combat operations are over and ISIL is defeated. That's a domestic national issue. I will not go into the US debate related to Russia and the elections. I will only say that this has in no way affected the work in NATO, the way we work together, all allies, including the United States, here in NATO, and also the way we share intelligence.
Russian media, gentleman in the white shirt.
Thank you. Mikhail Korostikov, Russia Commerce newspaper. First question, is there a possibility for a new Russia-NATO summit on a ministerial level? And the second, will any new proposals on the eastern flank of NATO be discussed on the upcoming summit?
What was the annual?
Is there a possibility that a new Russia-NATO meeting will be held on a ministerial level?
Okay. Well, we never suspended the NATO-Russia Council, and the NATO-Russia Council can meet on different levels: ambassadorial level, ministerial level, and also at the level of heads of state and government. And I remember when I was Prime Minister in Norway, I participated several times in NATO summits with President Putin, Medvedev, Prime Minister Medvedev, in different formats with them. So that's something which is still, what should I say, possible, but there are no plans to have such a meeting. So I think we are now focused on the NATO-Russia Council meetings on the ambassador level, and then we have to come back to, in the future, whether we will then address possible high-level meetings in the council. And the last question was about...
Will there be any new discussions about the new measures to strengthen the NATO's eastern flank?
Yes, I guess it will be addressed, meaning that I think many NATO allies will welcome the ability of NATO to implement, because I think we are all impressed by the way NATO has been able to adapt in a very short period of time to implement the biggest reinforcement of our collective defense since the end of the Cold War, and we've done that since 2014. And we have implemented the decisions we made in September 2014 in Wales, and we have implemented the decisions we made in Warsaw. And we are now deploying the 4 new battle groups to the Baltic countries and Poland. But I don't expect any requests for any additional measures. It is important for NATO to convey the message that we don't see confrontation with Russia. We don't want to provoke a conflict. Actually, our presence there is to prevent the conflict. And what we do is a measured defensive response to what Russia did in Ukraine. No one discussed the idea of having battle groups, NATO forces, in the Baltic countries and Poland before Ukraine. So this is a direct response to Russia's actions in Ukraine.
Go to Georgian media here.
Georgian Public Broadcaster Ketevan Kardava. Mr. Secretary General, what should Georgia wait for? Tomorrow, can you confirm that leaders will discuss the future of those countries inspiring NATO membership? And also, will you discuss the open door policy of this organization, Ukraine and Georgia? And also, this week, NATO Parliamentary Assembly will visit Georgia, and we want to hear from you the importance of this visit. Thank you very much.
I expect several allies to address the importance of our partners, including Georgia. And Georgia is a key partner for NATO. We have developed a very close partnership with Georgia, and we are implementing the different measures, the substantial package, the training center, more activities, more training, and more cooperation with Georgia. I also visited Georgia recently with the North Atlantic Council, and the NATO Parliamentary Assembly will visit Georgia in a few days. And I think the Deputy Secretary General will be there together with the parliamentarians. So that just shows, in a way, how much contacts, how much political dialogue we have with Georgia, and also practical support and cooperation. And Georgia contributes to NATO with forces in NATO missions and operations, including, for instance, in Afghanistan. And we are very grateful for all the contributions from Georgia to NATO, especially in Afghanistan.
ITN?
Also open door. Well, the decisions we made on open door still stands, including on what we decided in Warsaw on Georgia. And I think that this meeting proves that NATO's door is open, because at this meeting we will welcome Prime Minister Markovic of Montenegro and all parliaments in all 28 allied nations and Montenegro have now ratified the accession treaty. So we show that the NATO door is open, and we continue to work with Georgia, help to implement reforms.
ITN, third row.
Anna McIntosh from ITN. Just regarding the attack in Manchester, how much do you expect what happened on Monday night to be a topic of discussion during your talks tomorrow, and how much do you think it will influence those talks? And what sort of consequences do you see on the security in Europe as a result of what happened there?
The attacks we saw in Manchester will be something which will be addressed, I think, actually by all leaders in one way or another, because the attacks were brutal, and they deliberately targeted children, young people, and families, doing something which should be absolutely safe and secure, to attend a concert. And I think people are also impressed, and all NATO leaders are impressed by the way Manchester and the United Kingdom have reacted, because they stand up for their open societies. They don't want to change the way they live because of the terrorist threats, and they prove that they are also not willing to be intimidated and scared by this kind of brutal terrorist attacks. And I know the feeling in the way that back in 2011, Norway suffered a brutal terrorist attack where also many children and young people were killed. And it's always meaningless when innocent people are killed, but it's especially brutal when the lives of so young people are cut off in such a brutal way as we saw in Manchester. For me, this just underlines the importance of standing together in the fight against terrorism, recognizing or fully acknowledging that we need many different tools. We need to address the root causes inside our own countries, in NATO allied countries. We need political means, we need diplomatic means, we need law enforcement, we need intelligence, but we also need military means, and NATO has a role to play. And I expect NATO allies to step up and agree to do more in the fight against terrorism, not least because of what we saw in Manchester on Monday.
We had Europa Press, lady at the back.
Thank you, Secretary General Ana Pisonero. The possibility of having a center to fight terrorism, what would it exactly do? And do you expect this to be agreed by leaders? And a second quick question, if I may. What's the time slot that leaders will get for the interventions? Will it be the traditional 3 minutes or maybe a bit less? Thank you.
First of all, we will have a timer for the different intervention. That's something we always have in NATO at the different ministerials and different summits. So I just underline that to have a timer is a normal thing. The exact number of minutes, well, I think I have to tell that to the heads of state and government first, but it's a normal procedure we have at this meeting, as we have at all our other ministerial meetings. We have different centers of excellence addressing fighting terrorism. We are working also establishing I know that Spain is now addressing what they can do. So we are welcoming all efforts to do more in the fight against terrorism.
Lady in the front here, row here.
Жанна Безпечук, Громадське ТВ, Ukraine. The question on Ukraine, will the issue of Minsk agreement implementation be raised at this summit? That's the first question. And the second one, the Ukrainian president has banned the access to the Russian social media in Ukraine. How do you assess this decision, and whether you see NATO sees the Russian social media as a weapon in cyber warfare?
I expect several allies, and especially France and Germany being in the Normandy format, to raise and also to brief other allies on the implementation of the Minsk agreements. We have to remember that the main reason why, or at least one of the main reasons why NATO is implementing the biggest reinforcement of our collective defense and increasing our presence in the eastern part of the alliance with the 4 new battle groups and other measures is because of Ukraine. So NATO has responded, and we support also the economic sanctions of the European Union and the United States and other countries. We are concerned about the lack of implementation of the Minsk agreements. We have seen many violations of the ceasefire, and we have seen that heavy weapons are not being withdrawn from the contact line. We are in particular concerned about that the international monitoring mission, the OSCE monitors, are not allowed to operate. And recently we saw that one of them were killed and several were wounded. And this is really hampering the efforts of the OSCE to be able to monitor the Minsk agreements, the ceasefire, which is key to the implementation of the Minsk agreements. I've forgotten that.
Social media, Russian social media, and cyber warfare.
Well, we see how vulnerable many societies are against cyber attacks, and therefore NATO has significantly increased our own cyber defenses. We are also working with partner countries, including Ukraine, on how we can help them to strengthen their cyber networks, cyber defense. The Ukrainian government has made clear that this decree to close some of the sites is an issue of security, not one of freedom of speech. And freedom of speech is is part of the dialogue we have with Ukraine. It's extremely important for NATO. But it has been clearly stated by the Ukrainian government that this is not about limiting the freedom of speech, but it's something they have done for security reasons.
One final question, Romanian media, Adevărul, over there.
Cristian Munteanu, Adevărul. If you remember, in Warsaw, you talked a lot about defense and deterring. And in this context, I want to know what's the stage of the discussion about going on Romania and Black Sea security problems, because the Black Sea security is still an open issue. Thank you.
Well, we are increasing our presence in the Black Sea region. We are implementing what we call tailored enhanced forward presence, built around a Romanian brigade, but also with contributions from other countries in the region. We are also increasing our presence, naval presence, and also having more presence in the air. I know that United Kingdom are deploying planes to the region, conducting air policing. So NATO has increased its presence in the Black Sea region, and that is one element of the adaptation of NATO. And again, we are delivering. We have implemented the biggest reinforcement of collective defense, also in the Black Sea region, since the end of the Cold War. We have, after many years of decline, we have started to increase defense spending. Romania has announced that they will meet the 2% target this year. Latvia and Lithuania have announced that they will meet the 2% target next year. And then we have stepped up our efforts to fight terrorism by being more and more focused on training capacity building. And we have also been able then to deliver on the commitment on dialogue with Russia. So what we do in the Black Sea region is just one of many elements showing that NATO has been really able to respond, to adapt, and to change to a new and more demanding security environment. And that's the reason why NATO is the most successful alliance in history, is that we have been able to be united, but at the same time able to change when the world is changing. And that's what we're going to address when we meet tomorrow.
Thank you very much. This concludes this press conference. We have a timer on press conferences as well, but we're looking forward to seeing you tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you.